morning, everyone. I would like to say it's great to see everyone, but I actually can't, as you know, but it is great to welcome you all here today. It is the next in our series of networking events for women. And today I'm delighted to be joined by Tom Cheesewright, who is going to be inspiring us all to think about reality, which is a tiny bit scary at the moment with COVID, but also more importantly, recovery and opportunity. Many of you will probably have seen Tom last time on our summer networking event for women event. So it's fantastic to welcome you back, Tom. What we're going to do today is ask Tom to talk for about 20-30 minutes. And then once we've done that, we are going to open the floor to questions. There is a chat function, as I'm sure you know, at the bottom of your Zoom field. So do feel free to type in there any question that you want me to ask. I'll do my very best to get all of them answered within the next 20 or 30 minutes after Tom has spoken, but we are aiming to finish on time. And so please get your questions in early. We will be recording this and we will be sending out the recording to everyone afterwards. If there are burning questions that you've got, then I'm sure Tom will be pleased to answer them afterwards as well. So without further ado, Tom, I'd like to welcome you to the stage. For a very interesting and inspiring talk, because I've had a few snippets, so I know what's
Brilliant. Thank you, Philippa. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to my lab. I'm down in my basement today, which after the rains, if you hear a slight knocking sound in the background, I've just realized that there is a frog stuck the other side of my window and he keeps bouncing off the window at me. So if I occasionally look up and there's a knocking sound, you know it's a frog. Anyway, unusual distractions that you get on Zoom calls that you do not get when you are on stage. Let me open up some slides and I will walk you through it. I'm going to talk for about 20-25 minutes. And I will, oh, my video has stopped. There we go. Let me share. Dima, could you turn me on for screen sharing, please? And video. There we go. Start my video. Can't quite share slides just yet. Well, let me talk and I'll come back to that in a second. So this title of today is Reality, Recovery, Opportunity. And so I'm going to break the talk down into those three sections. Reality, I'm afraid, is the sort of the somewhat depressing part of the talk. There's some pretty ugly stats in the update since my last session. Some things that I predicted have sadly come to pass. And some things that actually we were talking about last time haven't changed. And so I want to talk about some of the same sort of things I talked about last time, but an update in terms of where we're at. Then I'm going to talk about recovery. I'm going to talk about what's next, the immediate future, the things that we can do, and do that with particular regard to certain sectors. Sectors I know that Freaks works with a lot of clients in, is very strong in. So I thought I'd pick a few of those out, and partly because they actually have an impact on us all, places like retail. And then I'm going to talk about the silver linings. I'm going to do a bit of a weather theme to all this, and I'm going to talk about some silver linings at the end. So Dima tells me I should be able to share. Yes, I can, Dima. Perfect. Thank you very much. Share screen and that one. Can you all see my slides now? Fantastic. So if I click there and hit an arrow, we should be able to move on to my first little disclaimer, which I've started giving in these sessions. Particularly I'm doing things that can come across as a little bit depressing at the start. I have to point out that what I talk about, the things I see, are not what I want. I'm not here to lobby for a particular vision of the future, much as I might do that in my private life over a couple of beers. I'm here to talk about what I see, and based on the analysis that I do, using a particular set of tools to try and understand what's coming next. So with that caveat out of the way, let me start with that, as I sort of pre-warned you, somewhat dark skies, that where we're at right now, and some of the promise these are the darkest bits of the talk, and I will finish on a much lighter note. I think we knew that a recession, to some extent, a collapse in GDP was coming following the last talk. When it came, it was marginally better than forecast. I think the forecast was 20.4%. But given how great it is, how big it is, the scale of that drop is still dramatic, still scary, and I think will drive some other following stats that I'll go on to talk about. This is an enormous collapse. It is greater than the one, as you can see from this chart, post-crash in 2008. A huge contraction that not just we are facing, but countries around the world are facing. And as I say, this will have a knock-on effect in terms of government spending, in terms of consumer spending, in terms of credit, etc. So be aware that this is the sort of the leading indicator, if you like. It's a following indicator of what's happened over the last few quarters, but it leads a bunch of other stats that we will get over the next few weeks and months around things like particularly employment. The second thing to say is, and I think it's actually been announced in the Times this morning since I wrote these stats, that we're going to be going back into lockdown, certainly in certain places. As is so frequent with this government, it was leaked to News International rather than sort of formally announced. But I think there's a good argument that one way or another, whether you place the cause of this at the foot of reopening schools, reopening universities, or reopening pubs and bars, I think everyone accepts that the messaging has been confused, that people didn't understand what they should be doing, and as I will go on to show, lots of people didn't do what they should do. And so although the death rate is much lower than it was, and actually once you strip out the increased prevalence of testing, the increased testing capability now, the numbers aren't what they were back in May. Chris Whitty's prediction of a few weeks ago of an exponential growth in cases, which at the time he was pilloried for, is actually looking fairly close to accurate. We're seeing a sort of very rapid doubling of cases. And so there are going to be more interventions, right or wrong interventions, targeted in the right places. With or without the right support, one way or another, we're going to see more interventions to try and bring the case count under control, particularly here where I live in the north. As I mentioned there, one of the contributors, arguably, to this rising case count has not just been the confused messaging, or perhaps the confused messaging contributed to this, but actually adherence to some of the recommended practices with regards to minimizing the spread of COVID-19 has been pretty poor. Now, again, I think the government's doing a very effective job at laying the blame at the feet of us, at the feet of people, the people who've been carrying the virus. But I think you can lay the blame at the door of the messaging. But if you actually look at some of the contributing factors, the common factors amongst those people who are most likely to break quarantine, to break self-isolation, they are very, very, very much down to dependence. People who had a dependent child and needed to get out and buy them food, people who were poorer, who couldn't afford not to work or to afford the reduced work on offer or reduced pay on offer, people facing particular hardship during the pandemic, whether that's age or loneliness, or people working in key sectors with a sense of duty. Once you ignore the fact that young men are particularly likely to just believe they're invulnerable and go out and ignore the provisions, all the other sort of contributing factors to people breaking self-quarantine, self-isolation were largely down to a sense of need. And so, I talked a lot about how COVID won't change 3 million years of evolved human behavior in the last session. It's true, it swings in both directions, and we're still very much only human and unable to overcome those needs for human contact, for food, and for money to heat our homes, etc., and the need to look after our children. So the last session I talked particularly about this difference between elastic and plastic deformation. So elastic deformation, you stretch something and it pings back. And forgive the engineering terminology, as you can tell from my background, that's something of my history. And I think over a short period, all of these changes we're going through, these changes in behaviors, they're very much elastic. We will snap back at some point. But if anybody knows who've worn an elasticated waist at any point, the further and longer you stretch it for, the less prone it is to return to its original shape. And so, the longer we're in lockdown, and it's going to be another 6 months where we're going to be at least in some sort of special measures, if not more, until we get proper distribution of a tested vaccine, the longer we are stretched, the longer these behaviors sustain. And this has particular relevance for certain industries which have had to adapt to the greatest extent, or have seen the greatest adaptation forced upon them over the last 6 months in terms of the way they work, the way human beings behave. And so, while I still think we will see a very great snapback to a lot of pre-COVID behaviours once lockdown is lifted, we're still human beings with that need for human contact, for romance, for company, to go out and see each other, to get together, to work together. The longer it goes on, the more plastic this deformation becomes, and the more the COVID trends and behaviours stick with us. Just finishing up, I hope, in terms of the current reality and where we're at. There's still a lot of bad news to come. We are barreling towards the potential of a no-deal Brexit. Right now, the banks seem to be hedging their bets, if not leaning towards a no deal being the most likely outcome. It's a bit 50-50, 60-40. There's not a great deal in it. But genuinely some serious fears / expectations that no deal will be what happens. So that's clearly going to disrupt an awful lot of things in terms of the supply of labour, in terms of currency, imports, exports, logistics, certifications on products, and on top of that, I think one of those following indicators, the data we get much later than GDP. Or at least a month later than GDP, is in terms of redundancies, and we are seeing some very, very bad news on this front right now. Earlier this year, I think in the first 6-8 months of this year, we'd already had 125,000 redundancies in retail alone. Forecast for this year is, I think it's not Retail Decisions, one of the retail analysts anyway, that I was looking at yesterday morning. Is that we're going to be well over 200,000 redundancies in retail alone, if not 250,000. So some really bad news coming in the last quarter of this year in terms of job losses, and obviously that has a knock-on impact on everything else. So that's the really bad bit. Let's talk about some slightly brighter news, at least for certain sectors. The prospects of recovery, and to continue my weather analogy, seems appropriate today when we started with pouring rain, and now there's some glimmers of blue sky out there, at least where I am, some silver linings. What are the near-term prospects for different sectors? And as I say, I'm going to focus on some of the ones where particularly with clients, given there's a good likelihood that some of you come from those places. And I think retail has been a particularly fascinating sector, the one that I get asked most about after just general conversations about the future of work. We've seen a fairly dramatic rise in online retail, particularly in some of the laggard sectors like grocery over the course of lockdown. We've dropped slightly back from the peak where we were all sort of bound to our homes, and I think it was around sort of 34-35% of all retail spend was online. That's dropped back now to about 26-27%, but nonetheless that is a massive leap from just a year before. And it's not that long ago, I think, that again one of the big analyst houses predicted, I think it was the CBI predicted that we were going to see 53% of all retail sales moving online by the mid-2020s. That's looking increasingly likely. And given what I've just said about in terms of redundancies, in terms of vacancy rates, now at sort of, I think, somewhere between 8 and 11%, depending on where you look and which stats you look at, that's clearly going to have some continuing dramatic effects. A big shift in terms of investment in distribution, big shift in terms of investment of online, but a continuing challenge for high streets and property owners with those vacancy rates and no obvious solutions to fill them. Some interesting campaigns going on right now around business rates in terms of changing the multiplier or rebasing those into different to a different different basis. Obviously that's where you rebase them. But I don't think that's going to save the high street. I just don't think there are the product categories out there anymore that make for a appropriate high street businesses, even with if there is a dramatic cut in rent and rates. And so there's a huge impetus towards more rapidly redefining what our city centres are going to look like. But in the meantime, the recommendation is to continue to drive investment into lowering the friction of your online channels and making it easier for people to buy in alternative and safe ways. Your food and beverage, the hospitality industry, you know, again, about to suffer another massive blow, particularly here in the northwest, where, you know, we're about to see bars and restaurants shut down again. The curfew has been terrible for them. I see new tweets every day from you know, retweets from clients in this sector of new places going bust, shutting down, at best hibernating through the challenge. I think, you know, unless the government is going to write off a lot of this sector, we're going to have to see new measures of support. And there's some really interesting rumblings coming out from former members of the government, people still closely connected to the government, in terms of leveraging low cost of borrowing to increase spending for support and support the economy over the next 12, 18 months as we sort of move towards recovery. Whether or not we will see that with this government, who knows? It's not necessarily been the best planned set of responses so far, and there does seem to be a fairly ideological reluctance to extend borrowing. You know, fine when it's a response to previous missteps, but less so when it's to support industry. Albeit, you know, one sort of bright spark of a potential no-deal Brexit is there won't be any constraints, or certainly fewer constraints. You know, there's an argument about whether there were already in terms of state aid. So the government might feel freed to sort of break international norms in terms of support. You did eat out to help out work. Was it the right measure? I think we'll be debating that for some time to come, and you know, there'll be a large number of economics PhDs done about it. But certainly it feels to me like there needs to be measures that encourage a high degree of safety while supporting these industries, driving people out to do things like you know, create new marquees on the street, expand into street space, shut streets down to create much more open space for people to work, to eat and get entertained, rather than doing things which compress people into small spaces like the curfew. In terms of the property sector, you know, moving away from retail but more into office space, for me, I still think lots of organizations haven't got their heads around what it means to move to a hybrid or remote environment long term. And let's be clear, you know, once you move to even a hybrid environment, all your processes have to be built for remote, because otherwise you are going to be excluding certain staff. You are going to have to change your sort of pastoral care approach to your employees in terms of ensuring that they are well equipped at home. We've seen lots of conversations already about issues with mental health, particularly amongst the young who've been isolated on their own. The next set of conversations to come is going to be about responsibilities for physical health, with people suffering back and neck problems beyond the existing levels of anxiety and performance over constantly being on screen, on camera, and opening up your home to people. So, you know, I still think there is going to be a big snap back to working in offices when people can, partly because the people who've had least opportunity to adapt have been managers who are struggling with the fact that all their previous methods of management, where they get some sort of physical oversight of the people they're leading in terms of who's working well, who's not, who's struggling, who's not, you know, all those have gone away. And you know, hence why we've spent so much time now on Zoom calls with people just sort of checking in on us. Yeah, office footprints are going to shrink. We are going to see much more, or rather an acceleration of the existing shift to co-working spaces, but they're not going away. And what the actual offices look like, you know, once we get into this post-COVID environment with people more concerned about infection, perhaps more desire for walls and doors so people can work a bit better in isolation and retain some of the benefits where they've been able to isolate at home and get some peace and quiet, that's going to be really interesting. From a residential perspective, there are anecdotal rumblings of deurbanization. It's a big conversation amongst a lot of futurists that actually the pandemic is going to kill off the attraction of cities and get people moving out into the sticks. This feels to me like a very narrow, very limited trend. And the same sort of groups of people who are absolutely thriving in a lockdown environment because they can go and work in their nice homes outside the city with their little pods in the, you know, office pods in the garden and brilliant broadband and their family and friends around them are the same ones who might be thinking, if they're currently living in the city, well, I can get out. For everybody else, you know, people still, you know, seeking partners, people still moving jobs fairly frequently and wanting physical access to them, people wanting access to a nightlife, people wanting access to schools, to hospitals, to doctors' surgeries. All of those people are not going to be getting out of the city that rapidly. And so I don't think this sort of deurbanization is going to be a massive trend, except for a particular age bracket of the most wealthy. So into opportunity, what are the not just the sort of the silver linings, but the real rays of light here? What are the bright spots in this sort of post-COVID environment? The first thing I want to say is that we can kind of see the future now. We've got much more visibility now than we did 3 months ago into what 2021 is going to look like, in terms of when there's likely to be a realistic vaccination, when we're going to start to see levels trail off, how likely it is that we're going to see future pandemics that look like this, and what impact that's going to have on our changing work and home behavior. And so with that foresight, we have to start to take decisions. We have to start to say, right, okay, this is what the world looks like now. We have to prepare to operate in it, not just survive in it as we described the last session as, but thrive. How do we thrive in this new environment? And I'm seeing a lot of organizations now who've perhaps deferred serious decision making, who've done the emergency response, now start to think about, okay, what does the next step look like? Let's build towards, if you'll forgive the phrase, the new normal. And that's in terms of implementing much more considered practices and processes in terms of remote and hybrid working. That's in terms of investing more in their digital channels and alternatives to their sort of high street presences. That's in terms of looking at their planning with regards to what they're constructing, infrastructure, etc., and rebalancing that towards a sort of post-COVID landscape. One of the really interesting things about how well remote working has worked is the benefits of that now most companies have realized. There are some who still can't. If you're running a sandwich shop in the middle of the city, you can't exactly do that remotely because your normal audience probably lives an hour or two away from where they were normally buying your sandwiches. But lots of organizations can now, and one of the big cost bases for lots of retailers was still handling cash. That has gone away to a large extent. Cash usage has halved in the first few weeks of lockdown. And while there's still a large constituency, we have to make sure we support as we move away from cash, the unbanked and the underbanked. There is now great opportunity to do things in a much more purely digital fashion and change the way we do things like checkouts, change the way we do things like customer service. Now that so many of us are working remote, we can start to think in a much more open-minded basis. Well, certainly once we've got the processes in place for remote work to work effectively, about recruiting globally, finding the best talent around the world to fill those needs we have. And particularly with regards to digital skills, where we are desperately undersupplied here in the UK, we can start to go and think about recruiting internationally to fill those gaps. And again, our Brexit exit may make that somewhat easier in certain ways. And finally, in terms of suppliers, now that everyone is investing, shifting their investment in digital transformation, and I'll be helping to launch some research over the next couple of weeks that plays to this, and I've seen some stats that just how much digital transformation programs have been brought forward, how much they've become a real source of focus, where lots of organizations knew they had to do it at some point. They're now realizing they have to do it now, not just the sort of the employee facing stuff and the customer facing stuff, but fixing and automating back-end processes that have lingered without investment for far too long. If you're in certain sectors, then there's a great opportunity, rising demand. The PlayStation 5 and I think soon the Xbox Series X, Series S will be selling out. I must get my order in because it's going to be a fairly quiet Christmas otherwise. I need some entertainment. But things, sectors like food and drink delivery, online groceries, home improvement, cleaning and hygiene, personal transport, getting people feeling the risks of public transport, remote fitness and wellness. These are all huge growth sectors that seem to be thriving right now, doing very, very well indeed. And while there's no real hard stats yet on a lot of these places, the research hasn't been done. You can see just from things like the speed at which the PlayStation sold out, just how big the demand for these classes of technology and services are right now. So to summarize then, this is from a chart, and I've had to keep writing her name down because I've got a total mental block for this woman's name, but Virginia Satter, this is the change model that she created for use in sort of family therapy, but I think it works very, very well in this environment and understanding the environment we're in now. As time goes on, we went from our status quo through this dramatic change event of COVID, and it dropped a lot of us into chaos. And we responded very, very quickly. There were some incredible achievements made during that period of response. I led a session with the leadership team for a local authority recently who've actually found through lockdown that they've adapted some behaviours that were much, much better than they were using before. And it was about how do we maintain those new behaviours. But we've been through this period of chaos now. We've now got some foresight of what the new normal looks like. And now really is the time to start taking radical decisions, to start to build your transforming idea of what your future looks like, and beginning that process of integrating those new ideas into the operating model, investing, experimenting, starting to build that new normal for what your organization looks like. Because although the next quarter is going to be pretty dark and we're going to see a lot more bad news, I think now we can start to restructure for what 2021 and beyond is going to look like, and go from that position of chaos towards, if not yet a new normal, at least a considered and planned and positive operating future. So that's me. I will open up to questions. It would be remiss of me, and I would get a slap around the chops from my publisher if I did not point you towards a couple of books. If you are interested in that process of innovation and reinvention and adaptation, then my latest book, Future Proof Your Business, is now available on audiobook and Kindle, and in the shops, or in paper if you like that sort of thing. It's there, recommended a couple of months back by the Financial Times. So please go and have a read and read a review. And that's me. And if you do have questions, you're interested in all this stuff, tomcheesewright.com. There's loads more of my thinking on these lines. Right, Philippa, back to you for questions. Yes, just need to come off mute, Philippa.
Brilliant. Thanks so much, Tom. That was really interesting, particularly around the section of where we are at the moment, and you're talking about people being in chaos and then trying to now radically plan for the future. Can you give us some examples of where people have adapted that you think we might all learn from and might be able to use some of their ideas into what we should be doing going forward?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think I gave the example last time, and it's a continuing success story of one of my local breweries, giving away my own sort of personal preferences here. But very rapidly invested in improving their digital front end, switched their draymen to delivery staff, and started doing door to door. I think actually some of the I think a lot of organizations have adapted incredibly well in terms of their technology. Getting people working remotely, that was I think a real success story. I think a lot of people deserve a pat on the back, particularly IT departments actually, who've been working all the hours to get things moving. And things like a lot of service industries actually as well have adapted very, very quickly. Like, again, my own hairdresser just recognized very early the way things were going, shut up shop, invested the return of his deposit into buying a van, kitted it out, had it panelled out and kitted out for hygiene and for hairdressing with a hairdresser's chair, and now drives around to people's homes and does sort of invites people into his sterilised van to do their haircuts there. So there are opportunities to do this in quite wacky ways, and I think that was a really early example. You did this sort of 3 months ago. Really like examples of people recognizing what the future looks like, taking a really radical decision and running with it. And I think the reality is that if he wants to get back into premises in 6 months' time, 3 months' time, he's probably not going to struggle that much, because I think there's going to be quite a few premises available.
Yeah, and as you are, as I am today, and as a lot of people on this call will be working from home, as you say, that's got a number of challenges. Is there any sort of best practice out there that you've seen that we all might want to learn from or adapt? Or is it so mixed for different areas?
No, I think the organisation that's got this most down albeit with the caveat that they're only 5 years old and they've spent, they've had $400 million of venture capital to make this work. There's an organization called GitLab, and they've actually published their entire operating manual online for how they work remotely. They're a fully remote organization. And while I don't think everybody can jump to that model very quickly, I think there's an awful lot of lessons to be learned there in terms of, and this is a really important thing to get your head around. There is no such thing as hybrid, as a halfway house between all working in an office and all working remotely. Because as soon as you go to a hybrid model, you have to treat everyone like they're remote, even if most of them are in the office. Because you can't do things like make decisions just with the people around the table, because you're going to be excluding a lot of important people from decisions. You can't run impromptu learning sessions without documenting them, because again, you're excluding a bunch of people. You have to move to an asynchronous model where all your decision making is done sort of via shared documents, where your training is recorded and shared with everybody. You have to make a lot of changes to your typical behavior, and it absolutely has some efficiency overheads at first, because you're investing a lot of time in sort of content production, in writing things down rather than having a quick conversation. The flip side is, and certainly their belief is, it leads ultimately to better decisions, to more considered decisions. Even if there is a bit of an overhead. But certainly I'm feeling the pain of this at the moment. Whereas before I might have done most of my, I get on a train or get on a plane, go and do a 1 hour keynote and then walk away again, and that's my job done. Now people are asking for pre-recorded hours, and as soon as you pre-record something, you're like, well, the quality's got to be better. I've got to eliminate all those ers and ums and breathing noises. I want to put some special effects in. So I've actually invested in turning my spare bedroom into a studio, so I can do all this stuff a bit more efficiently. So there's depending on what you do, there's going to be a lot of different changes, but definitely consider that issue of once you go hybrid, everyone is effectively remote in terms of your practices.
Yeah, just pulling on that point, when we first went into lockdown, working from home, and I'm still doing exactly the same. I'm in my dining room, as people can see, but I've noticed now quite a few more people that I'm talking to have actually got their logo screens behind them, so it looks all a bit more corporate. Do you think that's something do you think there's going to be a pushback? Because what I found was really nice about the first part of lockdown was, if your son wandered in, or the dog was barking, or the postman came, then nobody seemed to mind. Whereas in the past, it was like, oh my God, that's not very professional. Do you think there'll be a swing back to that, or do you think we'll keep this sort of relaxed culture working from home?
I think it's really going to be horses for courses. It depends on your sort of corporate culture. And also your individual culture. How comfortable are you with allowing all your colleagues into your home? How much do you want to show off? How much do you want to expose your kids, to on video, etc. And I think some organizations will get very, very corporate about it. I think lots of people will get very creative about it if they've got the space and the investment to do so. I mean, 50 quid, you can get a full green screen setup, and I could be absolutely anywhere right now, even without sort of functions built into Zoom. But I think it's really, but it needs to be defined. This is the thing. We need to have a conversation about it. We need to know what our etiquette, what our culture is. We need to have those things not just assumed, but sort of documented and discussed, because without that, you're going to get these real sort of culture clashes between sort of very sort of formal lockdown environment, between people who are very, very relaxed about it and sort of in their pajamas from the waist down, if not pajamas from the waist up. And those people who feel really excluded from this because they're sort of perched on the end of their bed in their 1-bedroom flat. So there's going to have to be a really big sort of corporate conversation about what our culture is, and that conversation has to extend beyond the bounds of the organisation into partners as well.
I was also want to ask you about recruitment. In the past, we've benefited being a national firm for people wanting to move around the country and therefore wanting to leave one firm to join another. But it occurs to me now that actually the response from a firm, if you wanted to leave to move to Manchester, London, Newcastle, wherever, they don't really necessarily have to move firms any longer, as long as the firm is open-minded enough to let them carry on work from home. So what do you think that's going to do to recruitment going forward?
I think we're going to see a much more liquid recruitment market, where actually, it's much, much easier for people to change jobs. So, if you're not bound by location, if you're still living in the same place but working for a completely different company, you can move jobs much more easily. I think it accelerates the trend towards freelancing. particularly for certain groups of people, because again, I've now got access to a global client base, just sat here in my home in Manchester. So, why shouldn't I freelance and draw work from all over the place if my skills are in demand? I think it presents a really, really interesting time for recruiters and employees alike. And I think the ones that succeed are going to be the ones who understand what binds somebody to their business once the physical restrictions have gone away, and the ones who understand how to access and take advantage of that talent pool in different ways. And that's going to be it's going to be a real mixture of part-time contracts. Particularly again with this, we need to rethink things as we shift away from the office. If somebody's not going to be in the office all the time, do we need them 5 days a week? Are they still contributing as much if they're not here 5 days a week? Or actually, do we only want 2 days a week from them? Let's contract them for 2 days and 3 days working for somebody else doing something different. Or actually, do they move completely freelance? And that has great implications in terms of the social contract between employer and employee as well. We've seen this dramatic increase in 0 hours contracts between the beginning of this century and the last 5 years, where it's sort of flattened out, where the company's taking less and less responsibility for people's welfare beyond outside of their working hours.
And one of the comments from the audience actually is global recruitment could be great for some industries, but won't help pick fruit and vegetables.
Yeah, and that's, as I say, one of my big concerns post-Brexit is labour supply for those industries where presence really does matter. Healthcare, agriculture, construction. We could be facing some really, well, we're already facing labour shortages in all of those places. We could be seeing an awful lot more, albeit, as I say, we're going to be seeing some very hefty redundancies in other sectors, but there's not necessarily obvious transferability between those skill sets.
You talked about the decimation of retail on the high streets. One of the questions I have here is, what do you think is going to be the new norm for high streets? What they're going to look like? What will we see?
So two things. I think in smaller towns and cities, the centre just becomes a very much more mixed use space. And we've been talking about this for a long time, but I think this is the catalyst that's going to make it happen. I think a lot of local authorities in the sort of post 2008 environment, where where there's sort of 1/3 of vacancies, thought we'd hit the bottom, and all the sort of the remedial action to try and tackle that was, how do we get back to where we were? And the reality is that situation's not coming back. There just aren't the product classes for us to retail that would justify having as many shops as we used to have. Media's gone online, 20% of fashion's gone online, rising percentage of groceries gone online. Gadgets have been condensed into a smartphone, a laptop, and a tablet if you're lucky. Maybe a games console, but again, all of those things are just as well sold online as they are on the high street. So there just aren't as many, with the exception of fashion right now, albeit I am expecting a backlash against fast fashion at some point, given its water consumption, energy consumption, carbon footprint, production ethics. A lot of these sort of product categories have declined. So we're not going to have as big a retail footprint anywhere. The big metro centres, Manchester, Birmingham, will still have a big retail footprint, but people will travel from further for a proper day or weekend away shopping. But that space, the space that's left, is going to be filled with homes, schools, doctors' surgeries, probably return of F&B. I think there will. We're still seeing coffee shops grow about 8% a year pre-lockdown. I think there's still room for more sort of third spaces like that. And much more of a living city rather than one that has very sort of discrete zones for retail, office space, and residential. Be much more integrated.
Well, we're certainly finding quite a lot of businesses now having pop-ups in the retail side. So, and landlords being really happy to do a 6-month or maybe a year lease or license. So I think that will help the entrepreneurs around and the small businesses. And I think you're seeing places in Totnes, for example, with lots of pop-ups rotating. So maybe that could be a way of regenerating some of the retail as well. So
yeah, I think it's that new world we've got to accept. Number one is, I think it's going to be hard to get those sort of long-term rental contracts from the big multiples, because there's just not as many of the big multiples. And you look at the number that have gone already this year in terms of TM Lewin and Monsoon, which may come back to some extent, but with many fewer stores. And those pop-ups may not be paying as much, and we're going to have to revisit business rates as well. because obviously the valuations are perhaps a bit skewed now.
So I think we all accept we've got to change, and some businesses have been changing and evolving. Some have done it radically, as you mentioned, but who are the best people in organisations to lead that change? Is it the management team, or do we need specialist change managers, futurists like yourself, Tom, to actually do that? Or are we capable within our own management structures of actually reimagining ourselves, do you think?
For me, I've been advocating for a long time, which may seem counterintuitive. I'm creating more competition for myself. I think we need more futurists, and not futurists like me. We need futurists inside organisations. And I'm constantly preaching to my clients that every leader at every level should devote 1% of their time to thinking about the future, and not just in a sort of abstract, daydreaming way, but in a structured fashion. Looking at what's coming next and what you do about it. And I give people methodologies for doing that. And so, I think what we need is, I also advocate for a very different structure of organization, where before our organizations have often been quite monolithic. We've tried to have a corporate culture and a sort of corporate organization. Whereas actually in this new environment, what we need is lots and lots of small, semi-autonomous organizations, each of whom can take responsibility for their own response to challenges like this and changing their own behavior, as long as they keep, maintain the service they provide to the rest of the organization. So what I'd like to see is, rather than sort of, diktats from, a few senior leaders in big organizations, I'd like to see them pushing power out to the edges, out to each individual function of the organization, and each of those functions making decisions to say, okay, this is what works for my people, for my culture, this is how we're going to change, this is how we're going to do things. And I was even seeing that pre-lockdown in a lot of cases. There's a case study or story in the latest book from a conversation I had with the CEO of HSBC, where they were already, he was trying so hard to push power down through the organization, not take responsibility on himself, but say, actually, no, look, you're closer to this problem. You're closer to the people it's going to affect. You're closer to the customers. You take the policy decisions that are right for your people in the organization.
Just switching topic a little bit here, the threat of insolvency has been hanging over a lot of businesses since March, but the data shows that insolvencies aren't really on the rise yet. Now, we know some of the reasons for that, obviously because of furlough and the delays in various payments. But what do you when do you think that will start to change, or do you think we might be able to limp into the next financial year and just get through it without too much damage?
I think a lot of organisations are not going to make it through Q4. I think a lot of people are going to find, Christmas is going to disappoint. I think Q4 is going to disappoint some people. Maybe that GDP's got even further to fall, which we'll see, particularly with the sort of second lockdown coming. And so I think, 47% of retailers and something like were already in financial difficulty before lockdown. And so according to the Grimsby review, the latest iteration of the Grimsby review. So, you can challenge those figures, but I think we are going to see more insolvencies in the last quarter of this year. Some will limp through. We may see a new government stimulus package, which allows more to survive into the next financial year. But I think they're probably going to come at some point. And the important point is, lots of those organisations, they were already on life support, right? They, a lot of organisations have been unfairly affected by COVID, and were this not happening, their businesses would be fine. But a lot more were already ignoring or fighting a downward trend in their business already, and this has just accelerated the process. So the insolvency may have come in 2 years, 3 years, 4 years without the pandemic. It's just come an awful lot sooner than they expected.
Taking adaptation a stage further, and the people we employ, is it now the case we should be looking even more for multitasking employees in the future, and perhaps even looking at ourselves just slightly differently and what we should be doing?
I do think there's a core set of skills that make people particularly valuable in the current environment, and that's not to diminish the importance of real expertise, though. I think while I think everybody needs to have this sort of what I call the 3 C's, this ability to discover and qualify information, to synthesize new things and to communicate. I think those skills get more and more important in this very distributed environment. We still need real experts with a deep level of knowledge and skill in particular domains. It's just that we need those skills to be wrapped in that capability to communicate them as well. And so I think a lot of our issues of the last few years have been down to our denigration of experts. I'm hoping that we return some faith into them, albeit with the anti-vaxxer movement at the moment. I don't see it happening right now. But yeah, I think employers need to invest in their people who are having to learn new skills to adapt to this new environment. And if you want to keep those people, and you don't want very, very high staff turnover, I don't know about multitasking, but that ability to do what we're doing now, to self-direct your own learning, to operate in this sort of asynchronous fashion, to communicate really clearly via the channels that your organization's using, and actually digital skills as well. Take some of the pressure off your IT team, and start to use this opportunity to drive digital skills out into the organization so that people can co-create new solutions to your customers' problems rather than having to go out and outsource or try and recruit very, very expensive people who are in short supply.
I've got another question here about that remote working model you mentioned. Can you just let us know again who that was?
Yes, it's a company called GitLab, GITLAB. If you Google GitLab model, I think you'll find it, and it's a brilliant, like huge array of documents that have been really interesting for me.
So in this period of change, do you think that it's really important now to create this environment of innovation, or do you think it's better still to keep it within a tight-knit community? And if it is to be wider, how do you do that, and what should it look like?
So, I mean, there are lots of different models for this. I do think it has to be wider. I don't think you can, I've seen some really successful models like, Bromford, the Housing Association, which has a dedicated innovation team split into two. So they collect ideas from across the business, write them up as a proposal. The other half of the team assesses them and tells them whether or not they can proceed with it. If they get the approval, they go back and the first half of the team prototypes it, and then the assessment side of the team assesses it and says, okay, the prototype's a success, let's roll it out. Now, it's a very centralized model, but they're drawing ideas from across the organization, and they've absolutely encouraged everyone to contribute to this sort of innovation program to say where they think they can see improvements and how those can be implemented. But by and large, I'm a big fan of distributing that effort. As I say, pushing power to the edges of the organization, giving people responsibility and autonomy. I'm sorry to do a third plug, but there is a whole chapter on this in here. How do you give people that responsibility and autonomy to take innovation on? And I take examples like BMW, which I contributed to their program last year, where they're training all of their managers in what they call this ambidextrous thinking concept. Which I think comes out of Harvard. Because I actually met one of the colleagues of the guy who created it recently on a podcast. Where on one hand, you've got to keep business as usual going, got to keep ticking over, got to keep serving clients. But on the other hand, we've got to acknowledge that we've got to change, that we need innovation. We probably need radical innovation right now. And so I've got to carve out a proportion of my time to devote to that continuous innovation. So in answer to your question, I think it should be a distributed job, even if there is perhaps a central resource to support that innovation, ongoing innovation.
Thank you. Back to recruitment now. Do you think that recruiting staff from overseas without requiring the recruit to move will increase as a result of this?
Yeah, absolutely, undoubtedly. I think you're probably seeing, I haven't seen any news about this from the likes of Fiverr, this sort of the gig economy type platforms. I think they're probably seeing a real boom. Likewise, places like Odesk. And yet, why wouldn't you? If you can recruit from a global talent pool to find the best, both skills but also value for money, why wouldn't you? We've proven to ourselves during this period that we can work remotely effectively, given certain caveats. I think we're definitely going to see an increase of international recruitment like that.
Thank you. Now, I think we've got time for one last question, and I've got a fantastic question here. So what would you have done differently to avoid less economic impact, Tom? That's a fantastic question from the audience.
Yeah, I would have gone full Keynes and borrowed, spent. I think money is cheap right now, although our currency does face some risks from Brexit. We're still a relatively large economy that could afford to build up public debt. Our public debt's already enormous. What's another few billion, frankly? And we're going to recover it an awful lot more slowly if our economy is in a total mess. So I would be borrowing big right now. Whether it's sort of Green New Deal, I mean, not 160 million or 50 million on wind farms is an absolute pittance. And is going to do nothing for anybody. I would be investing in reinventing our city centres, in zero carbon programs, in innovative transport options, in the sorts of technologies where we already have a world leading advantage, and actually in education as well. Education and the arts sectors where we have world leading industries, but seem to be desperately undervalued by government after government. I would be putting money their way, saying, how do we take the incredible knowledge base we have in our university sector and become the world leaders in online higher education? How do we take the incredible knowledge base we have in material science and create a new wave of patents that are going to drive British industry for the next 50 years? How do we completely decarbonize our economy and rebuild our infrastructure for the rest of this century? We could do those things. We could borrow enormous sums of money because we're going to be suffering for an awful lot longer if we let the economy get into a really terrible state before we try to recover. And at some point, someone's going to have to borrow. Why not do it up front and save us the pain?
Well, Tom, thank you for that. That's been absolutely fascinating session. I know from all the questions that we've had that people out there in the audience have all enjoyed it as well, particularly your tips around what we can do to change and looking at how we need to change, and your observations on what has worked for businesses and what hasn't, and the need for us all to reimagine ourselves. So I'd like to thank you from the whole of the audience, and certainly from Freeths, for your time today. I'd like to thank everybody that's taken the time out to be here with us. We're very grateful for you to do that. Please do let us know what other topics that you would like us to cover in the future. It's great for us all to learn together, to reimagine and become different together. We need to change, we know that, and everything that we can do to help each other to do that will be beneficial long term. So thank you again, Tom. Thank you to everybody else for fantastic questions, and look forward to seeing you next time.